Welcome to this April-May 2023 edition of Protein Production Technology International. And for this feature on alternative seafoods, we're pleased to be speaking with Christopher Leclerc, who is the CEO and co-founder of Loki Foods. They're a startup that we featured in our news last August after a significant raise was announced. We believe that the company, formed last year, is the first in Iceland to be producing plant-based seafood. And as Christopher will no doubt detail, they're starting that journey with an alternative Atlantic cod fillet. So first off, Christopher, how did you get into this food tech space?
Yeah, so I've been a plant-based vegan consumer for 16 years, 17 years. Before then, I stopped eating animals about 20 years ago. My background is I have a master's and PhD in public health or epidemiology. So there's a lot of focus in food and environmental health. And then as time went on, I progressed very quickly into uh, biotech. And so I was working with health tech, med tech companies, even some type of pharmaceuticals and research organizations. And so this was with my whole life, this was a sort of a natural progression into things. And so about a few years ago, I started to have this idea about doing the world's best alternative seafood from the seafood capital of the world. No one consumes more seafood per capita than Iceland. So the bar for seafood is incredibly high. Also, the bar for plant-based is incredibly high. We have the world's largest fully vegan grocery store actually here in Iceland. And so that's around that time I met my co-founder, who's a food scientist by training, a professor and researcher at the University of Iceland. And that started more of the professional maneuvering and melding into food tech.
Right. And what was the inspiration behind you starting Loki itself? I mean, where did the name come from, first off?
Yeah, so most people know if they know Loki, they know Loki from the Marvel series, right? But Loki itself, or himself, or themselves, they are the trickster god in Old Norse mythology, and Loki was respected, but not always very popular amongst the main gods or the powers that be, and that's because he just didn't go again, with the same rhythm that they wanted, which was um, uh, falling in line to a system that was only working just for a select few. And so much so that he played a central role in the end of that world system, or the end of the world, and that was called Ragnarok. That was the event around it. And it wasn't the end of the world ultimately. It was just relatively the end of something that wasn't working, and brought about the demise of most of the gods, who were essentially exploiting the whole system just for their gain, and then bringing about the shift for the benefits of a greater majority. So the name found its way to us rather serendipitously, through a co-founder's girlfriend who has a background in Old Norse studies, and it just fits perfectly with what we're doing. He was also a
Yeah.
shapeshifter, so he turned into many forms. He actually turned into salmon once to outrun Thor.
So, okay, I mean, looking at the bigger picture, why did you pursue seafood as opposed to, a different animal-based protein?
Yeah, if you look at meat, dairy, chicken, fish, and the alternative options for it, uh, seafood is certainly not the lowest hanging fruit. If you've done one species of fish, for instance, they do salmon. Well, whatever ingredients go into that to make it a good nutritional profile, great functionality, nice texture, is just not going to work for whitefish.
Mhm.
And so, if you're looking at the lowest hanging fruit, um, you're gonna, if you have a pea protein, you can make minced beef, and you can do the same thing with a burger, and then you can just run the gambit on cattle related products. With fish, it's just not like that. It's with seafood, it's not like that either. So you can make something that's kind of like a white fish. Well, then if you're sticking to seafood, how are you going to do caviar? That's totally different. Or how are you going to do salmon? That's different too. Or roe, or just down the line. And so when we looked at the challenges ahead and the absolute existential need for addressing seafood with better alternatives that are healthy for you and healthier for the planet than the status quo of conventionally sourced. So fish farming itself is the math behind that. It doesn't make sense either for sustainable environments. Certainly not. It's not healthy for the fish as well. And then at the same time, the wild caught is helped to create the mess that we're in. and something to the effect of 90% of all fish species are on the brink of destruction or almost gone. The reefs are destroyed. If you think about the plastics in the ocean, it's something, the vast majority of plastics in most part of the world are actually coming from fishing nets, not coming from plastic straws or plastic bags. Of course, it all makes a dent and helps. And and I like to say that if our land was in the same state of affairs as the ocean, we would already be living in a dystopian society, right? And so what that means is, products themselves won't convert people so much. People change their behaviors almost wholly as a result of some type of internal conviction for why they need to, either it's their own health or it's sustainability. And usually that comes in through conversations with their loved ones, their kids, their family, their friends, or their own type of research, right? They're not walking in, all of a sudden they see a plant-based fish in a store and they're like, oh, I'm not gonna eat fish anymore, right? They may not even try it as a result of it. But that type of shifting, the mental shifting, is coming from the secular trends of the society and culture they're living in, so their local culture, but then also the one globally. And then that is then facilitated by whether or not they have options for it. So we see here in Iceland, we have a huge plant-based community here. It's massive. And most of them consume fish 5 to 7 days a week. They've made a shift. Most of them have made a shift away from that with no viable, highly functional, good, delicious, nutritious, plant-based fish alternatives at all on the market. There aren't really any here. I mean, there have been in the last couple of months, but they're like fish nuggets. They're not something you cook on a pan and have a fish dinner. And they made that transition, that shift, without these products in place. The products themselves are not meant to, if you want to emulate fish completely, well, you're going to have to do cultivated. You have to grow in the lab, and that's one of our aims too, of course. But if that's the products themselves are not there to convert anyone yet, the conversion happens steps before that, right? And so for us, the inspiration is knowing that we are in the seafood capital of the world, supplying 1.5% to 2% of the global catch. 50% of that value of that catch is coming from whitefish and cod specifically, so much so that we call it white gold in the North Atlantic, in Iceland and other parts of the North Atlantic. And if a 0.5 degree change in the temperatures around the oceans of Iceland happens, which will happen, then cod is going to migrate away from the shores of Iceland. There's no amount of sustainability that a fishery can do or government can do, especially not a local small one like this, that's going to stop that, right? And so the owning up of, okay, if you want to be the leaders of seafood, how do we do this? What are the realities that we have to face, and how we can get there? And alternative seafood, alternative fish is exactly one of those options and avenues to help seafood survive here.
Yeah, I guess that's why you're focusing on cod first, as being so important to the community there in Iceland.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the conservational problems of cod, you mentioned there that the temperature increase is going to see the fish migrate from that area. You mentioned microplastics. There was a big announcement last week, I think, in terms of ocean protection. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah.
So it looks like lots of countries are actually starting to take this seriously because, as you say, the oceans are in a really bad state. I mean, in terms of product development, what have been your biggest challenges that you've faced so far, and how, for instance, do you overcome some of those?
Well, if you think about fish is such a tricky thing to emulate in plants, but you have taste, texture, so there's mouthfeel in there. You have functionality, you have nutrition, then you have appearance. You have a lot of things. And if you look at the different alternative seafood companies that exist now, but also the ones that are coming, or the ones that have announced themselves, you can see that some have decided to pick perhaps a fish that's a little bit easier to do. So if you use pea protein, for instance, it's going to have more of a salmon type of hue to it, color wise, and then it gives you a good protein profile. And then you have to if you do some type of extrusion, then you can make the appearance look like it. But what you're going to lack in is most likely is going to be the texture element of it, and then also probably some functionality components too. And we've heard this that some of them are doing salmon to kind of taste like oatmeal. in terms of texture, right? Um, but when you're trying to develop a fish analog, some things have to give, and with plants, some things have to give. For us, we chose to develop from the stance of functionality and nutrition,
Mhm.
and we knew that then texture will fall in line with that very quickly, and we were able to do that just within our first months of developing
Yeah.
with early prototypes with our first product, Whitefish, of course, but how we're developing, nutrition, functionality, and then texture, because taste is an easy one. The taste is easy for fish. I mean,
Right.
most parts of the world would prefer fresh fish. So the fresher the fish, the less fish taste it has. Of course, novel products like alternative seafood, well, you need to maybe remind people that it's fish a bit. And so putting in that taste of a fish experience will be sort of, there's going to be a fine balance there, right? But if we were to put even a high fish taste into our products here in Iceland, people wouldn't like it because they grew up eating fresh fish,
Yeah.
right? And so they grew up not having the taste of fish. And so now you're building something that is a very similar experience as fish, but then all of a sudden it tastes like fish. It's like, okay, well, there's emulation there. So um, that for us, we started with nutrition and the functionality in the kitchen as being the
Mhm.
most important.
Yeah. In terms of that nutrition, I mean, how do you actually engineer that into a plant-based product? Because there's that balance, isn't there, between the number of ingredients in a product
Yeah.
versus trying to mimic the real thing.
Yeah, that's right. Bjorn, so my co-founder Bjorn, he's food scientist. He's worked with PepsiCo. He's worked with huge organizations globally on product development and research development. And he's been teaching actually his graduate students how to focus on sustainable food. And so with a sustainability focus, and I think just his experience and how he just senses into how to develop this made his intuition sort of gravitate towards the not just the right proteins, but the right blends of it to help, balance this high protein, low carb, low fat uh, fillet, you could call it, um, that is also contains few ingredients. So it's something that is close to what we would consider a clean label.
Yeah.
And I think being able to sense into that was good. We've tried more conventional off the shelf protein sources just to see. And, it comes down to finding the right blend and balance there.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned before that you've been working with restaurants and you're hoping to have some in retail later in the year.
Mhm.
Um, Obviously, working with those restaurants and chefs, presumably that functionality aspect, how you cook it and how it cooks is really important as well.
Yeah, it is. It is super important. We don't want to a point, we don't want to dictate how it's used.
Mm.
Um, of course, all foods you buy have some type of, you know, you have to use it a certain way to an extent. Um, but for us, the classic way of cooking cod in Iceland is actually the fillet itself is on a pan
Mhm.
with onion, and it's, cooked with oil and butter, and so the fish taste is kind of like cooked out. And so for us, starting there, but also then developing something that can be battered and deep fried and served as the most ideal vegan fish and chips you could possibly imagine. And so that functionality and working with chefs, but also working with people. I mean, that has to be the non-chefs. That has to be kind of the go-to. Like, is this, you can develop products that can, you can make it look great in your early stage developments, and as long as a chef is working with it, it's great. But this
Mhm.
sort of needs to be more or less easy enough that someone can have a vegan fish meal just within 15 minutes by themselves and not be a chef. That's very important.
Yeah. I mean, I went to an exhibition last November in London. I think it was Plant-Based World Expo, and I tasted some fish alternatives there, and I must admit I was blown away. That there was a smoked salmon that was just unreal. There was a tuna that was fantastic.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the technology is improving all the time. The ingredients is improving all the time, and people like me just wouldn't know the difference. I mean, we'll come on to the consumer in a moment, and their acceptance of it. But this whole space, especially in seafood, it's a close knit community, and you probably keep an eye on developments elsewhere in your sector. Is there anything from another company out there that's really impressed you, and why would that be? Something that you've tasted or seen and just thought, wow.
Yeah, there's a lot, Um, we it's stuff certainly small, like you said. We're most of us are on a first name basis, good terms. There's even a WhatsApp group for founders of alternative seafood companies.
Is it really?
Yeah, yeah. I'm a big fan of Plantish.
Okay.
So they haven't launched just yet, but I'm a big fan of them because of the reasons for starting this is very much aligned with why we started this too, which is vegan for the environment and animals, of course, but certainly vegan for plant-based for the environment, and OFEC and the other founders. That's why they started this. They have a background in this, and they don't sleep for this. In the face of this turbulent market time, right? Companies like us we're not going to go away. And Plantish is the same, even if in struggling to, because of hyperinflation and market conditions and stuff, where, face of funding problems that some companies may have, those that are still building in the face of it all are the ones that are very high in my list of respect there. Product wise, the ones that are on the market, we're fans of Hooked. We like Hooked. We say that's more fun seafood than what we would consider actual seafood, or what Icelanders would consider actual seafood, like fish fingers or shredded salmon, or even tuna that you would put in a tuna sandwich. Not really what Icelanders consider to be a high bar of seafood, but at the same time, they're getting products out there. They're getting people thinking about it. They're getting people trying it and experiencing it.
Yeah.
And then of course I would say another one is Revo Foods. I love just the energy they put into the products they're putting out there. We believe that salmon and tuna while we're going to have products for those later on, they weren't the lowest hanging fruit. We believe they're easier to do. Tuna, certainly in terms of texture, it's easy. And then salmon is a little bit easier because you can hide it by calling it smoked. And tuna, the texture it's just different than what you'd expect whitefish to be if you're cooking it on the pan. Again, it's a small group of us, but there's a lot of respect for all that are for everyone that's helping to, raise the tide, not just profit from the tide.
Sure. Well, all three of those companies are going to be in this feature with you. Plantish,
Oh, great.
Hooked, and Revo Foods. I guess the method of Revo's production is quite interesting with its 3D printing to create that sort of structure of a fillet. Okay, we're going to come on to the consumer now, and that is obviously always one of the barriers. I mean, there's regulations and there's funding and there's all of these challenges that you guys face. But how are the consumers and traditional fish producers, how are they reacting to this whole new field of plant-based and fermentation-derived and salag seafood?
The majority of consumers don't really know. I would say those that are on the kind of the outskirts or the extremes of it. The extremes, I mean the outliers are those that are became vegan or plant-based many years ago. When there were no options for anything, right? The way food is it's the main and major food companies around the world. They more or less operate as distribution channels and financial services companies, right? So it's not so much, they're not so much dictating to a point. They're not so much dictating what they want consumers to have. To a point, they are for sure. But in terms of trends of people wanting to reduce their meat intake or fish intake, and to consume less dairy, that's not really a more or less. That's not really a narrative that's being pushed from the top, right? That's bottom up. And so what happens is then over time, the main distribution channels, which are the main food companies, they haven't been doing much innovation. They acquire companies like us, and once the consumers have sort of pushed a certain bar of this is what we want, well, then those companies come in, buy or partner with companies like us, and then they plug it into the distribution channel, and that's just how things go. And you can apply that same algorithm to basically all sectors, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just how things are. Consumers themselves that we've been working with, by far and large, love what we're doing. So they're not just vegans; they're also people that have fish allergies, and they're not just people that have fish allergies. They're also people that just consume fish and are a little bit more sensitive to it. And here in Iceland, there's been a waking up over the last couple of years um, to just the state of the ocean, and perhaps how we had this big uptick with fish farming, particularly as it relates to salmon. It seems to be very difficult to do with cod or just there's not the focus. And all of the information that's coming out about certainly the health of the fish, so much so that they have to die, and the how they live, the quality of life, but then also the effects that it has on the land itself and the water use, antibiotic use, pesticide use, all that. It's just a matter of time before this new paradigm of educated and informed consumers just starts to say rather no to that, right? There will be market for that, but the slow waking up is one that we're seeing. Consumers are becoming more and more engaged and responsive to this. Fisheries themselves, that's going to be a little bit more tricky. Fishing is it's a cutthroat, low margin industry. Fishermen themselves don't make much money. And the same with dairy farmers, they don't make much money, right? It's the ones that are sort of owning the top of it, owning the quotas and plugging it in and selling it to grocers are the ones, right? The others run at even razor thin margins. Fishermen know very well, especially here in Iceland, that one year they just may not even have an income, right? And they just have to go do something different. And so everyone, for the most part, most people know what's going on, right? It's just the how to achieve, like how do we in a new paradigm of a sustainable environment that is also enabling a regenerative planet, how do we go about that, right? So that we can still have seafood, for instance, and I think a huge aspect of that and what we're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years is just a total acceptance of the future of food, which is, if you think about it, I'm just talking about in terms of animal-based or animal-derived ingredients, all of it is going to be replaced, right? Yeah. It's going to be replaced with plant-based fermentation and cultivated. So that's everything from whole cut steak all the way down to gelatin and ingredients used in cosmetics and pharmaceuticals.
Yeah. Well, it's a generational thing, isn't it? I guess generations Alpha and Gen Z, they're going to be more in tune to these sorts of products in the future. So it's going to take time, like you say. Price is another issue. I mean, I'm often at the supermarket and perusing those aisles, that plant-based section of the aisle, and it gets bigger and bigger. But there's quite a long way to go before we can really achieve proper price parity. I mean, what is the situation with your part of the market, fish?
Mm-hmm. The price of fish it varies according to where you are in the world, but everything's going up in prices. Everything always does go up in prices, right? And I firmly believe that the price of plant-based options will be cheaper than the conventional options very soon. Mm-hmm. And that's just in a world that governments are doing what they can to enable sustainability, subsidizing industries and sectors that are the opposite of that, while then they're spending money on sustainable measures, just doesn't make sense, right? And so over time, as these subsidies are removed, these externalities are also factored in, be it carbon emissions, the dumping of plastic nets into the ocean, the bycatch that happens and is wasted, all these things. Once all that starts to get factored in more and more, and then all the inputs into domesticated animals too, all those inputs of feed and water, everything that can just be more simplified and used into plant-based, it's just a matter of time where that math catches up. If we want to be a part of the planet's party over the next few hundred years, we have to adjust what we're doing. Planet will be fine; it'll fix itself. But whether or not it wants us involved is where we have to test ourselves. And then I believe, so I firmly believe, just with our own products, we bring it back down to ground where we're aiming for price parity with the price of cod as soon as we can. And we have a high quality product, and we will have healthy margins by far. And at the same time, because we're innovative, few ingredients, innovative in production as well, that we have a lot of conviction that will be price parity with cod, just even where the prices are now, as soon as we can. But then, of course, we'll be by far price parity with the other high quality plant-based proteins that exist.
Yeah. I mean, price parity is obviously one of the tipping points for these products to take off. Are there any others that you can identify?
I would say it goes back to nutrition. It just has to be giving options that are healthier, superior in nutrition. Like, people generally associate fish as being healthy, very healthy. I'd argue that it's not that healthy as people consider. Obviously you can get your EPA and DHA and omegas there, but the bioavailability, the absorption rate that happens in there, it's actually, you get a higher absorption rate having algae, which is regenerative and plant-based. And that's actually where different types of algae, that's where fish get their omegas from. So being able to include that, from the source of it, more from the source of it than essentially the middleman, which is fish, that is just processing it, right? People talk about like, plant-based is a little bit overly processed. Well, so is meat, right? And so is fish and chicken and everything. And if you actually know what happens within the meat industry about, the whole processing of the meat itself to finally get to your table, well, there's processing on top of the processing that animal is already doing with the source of the ingredients that we could just be eating ourselves and having our bodies process it. So, that's nutrition is a big one, and just building that up there to the pedigree for consumers to understand.
Mm-hmm. And what's next for you guys? You've mentioned during the course of this interview, cell ag is something you might be looking at or cultivated. You've also talked about other species of fish as well. What's next? Can you give us any exclusives?
Yeah. So we will be going after. We'll have a strong, fleshed out line of alternative seafoods across many different types of species of just sea life, right? We will be moving on to other areas of non-aquatic species life as well, plant-based side. I can kind of give you that.
Okay. Well, we'll have to come back to you as and when you make those announcements and those next breakthroughs. Christopher, thank you very much for joining us. It's been fantastic, and hope to see you soon, and certainly sample some of your products.